Well, when we were talking earlier in the week, and Don and I were both talking about the way we do our work, we were thinking about giving voice, to others, and truth. And so, Don, you want to start off talking about some of the works that you have and what you were saying to us about preserving or exposing the truth about North Tulsa and Greenwood?
Thank you, Deborah. One of the things I want to, first of all, I want to thank Philbrook for this honor of acquiring some of my work, and I do appreciate that. Thank you so much. This lady, Susan Green, has been a real help to me. She actually did a lot of research on some of the images that I have also. Found the name of one of my favorite images, and that is the Baltimore Barber shop. That photograph was taken in 1970, I believe. I can't believe it's been over 50 years since that photograph was taken. This is a photograph that is very emotional to me, because I think it's the essence of what Greenwood and the destruction of Greenwood is all about. His name is David Garnett. He had a business on Greenwood. He was a barbershop. Baltimore Barbershop is the name of it. He had his business on Greenwood for more than, I believe, 15 to 20 years. The photograph shows him peering out of his window. And what he was looking at was the bulldozers as they were destroying Greenwood right in front of his eyes. And when I look at this photograph, I get very emotional. And excuse me. His story was very poignant. He was a barber on Greenwood for several years.
And Don, do you mind lifting up?
I'm sorry, excuse me, Susan. And what happened is that he was about to lose his business. He told me that he did not know whether he was going to be next, because they were destroying most of the businesses on Greenwood during that period of time. They had no regard for any of the people that were living in that area and had businesses. Urban renewal, sanctioned by the city of Tulsa, was going through the area and just destroying everything in sight without any regard of people's lives or their livelihood. After I took the photograph, I came back the next day, excuse me, and his business was gone, so was he. I had no idea what happened to him. Susan did some research. She found that he had passed away in 1990. So I had no idea what his future was. I had no idea what he was going through and what his next step was. He didn't even know. I looked into his eyes, he looked into my eyes, and I said, I'll see you tomorrow. I never saw him again. His business was destroyed the next day.
We talked some about urban renewal, and I'm a descendant of survivors of the massacre. And my grandparents' home after rebuilding was on Lansing. And I think we talk about Greenwood, people think about the street Greenwood. But the Greenwood district was 35 to 40 blocks of homes and businesses, and Lansing was also part of that Greenwood district. And my grandparents' home was still standing. My aunt, my mother's oldest sister, lived in that home on Lansing until urban renewal, and when people were forced to leave their homes. And so that house stood there for the longest, and it is, the address I still know, it was 1342 North Lansing Avenue, and that was my grandparents' home.
The photograph you see here is what I call So Near, So Far. It's a man walking down the racetrack. I'm sorry, I keep looking at this and I keep doing But anyway, I keep looking at that, and I keep looking at that, I keep looking at that. So I'm gonna try to get used to this. But anyway, this is a photograph that we call Souvenirs of Far. You can see the old National Bank building in the background. And what I tried to do with this photograph, I tried to show the wealth that was Tulsa. And you see here Greenwood. You can see the buildings on Greenwood right here and some of the tracks that ran through Greenwood. Now the railroad tracks actually ran from Sand Springs. They came through Greenwood. People were actually board the Sand Springs line and go to Sand Springs to work. Is that correct, Deborah?
Yeah.
So anyway, what I was trying to do with this particular photograph was show the wealth of Tulsa and the poverty and disparity that was on Greenwood. So this was sort of just to propose the images together. So that was my intentions on that.
And when I looked at this photograph, that was one of the commentaries that I wrote was on this particular photograph because it reminded me of a science fiction movie that I had seen called, and it was called The City and the City. And the people were trained from birth, their brains were trained not to see the other side of the city. So there was not a literal wall, but they faced a penalty if they noticed the other side of the city. And one side of the city was prosperous, the other side of the city was not. And so this photograph reminded me very much of that movie.
We'll do the next photo.
Sure.
This is an old lady that I found on Greenwood. And one of the things that was very interesting about her was she refused at first to allow me to take a photograph. Again, if I did this again, I put it up here like this, and have a little connection.
I'll try to remember, but when you're talking to me, I forget.
But anyway, I'm sorry. We're holding a conversation. Yeah. Okay, let's try to get this together. This lady was on Greenwood, and it was a cold day as I walked up to her, and I asked if I could take her photograph. Now, when I do photograph anyone, I first of all ask their permission. I don't want to take, unpermitted photograph of anyone. I asked her, would she mind if I took her photograph? She said, no. Well, anyway, what I did, I persisted. I kept asking her if I could take her photograph. And she finally relinquished and she said, yes, go ahead. The interesting thing about this photograph, if you notice, she has a fly swatter in her hand. This photograph was taken in a cold day in December. You understand there was no insects around at that particular time, but she had this fly swatter in her hand. I thought that was very interesting. If you notice also, there's a little cat down at the bottom where the chair is. That was one of her pets at the time. During the time that African American men and women, during the summer times, they always would be out on their porch. And they would congregate, people in the neighborhood would talk to one another. You don't have that nowadays. People don't talk to one another. And that's the problem that we have because we don't understand. Nor do we talk to one another to get an understanding of each other. We don't have a lot of empathy for one another either. That's a problem that I have seen. But this old lady was very gentle, very convenient, and it's a very interesting photograph. I tried to show her in an interesting pose. Okay. Deborah, do you have any more to talk about some of those things that you witnessed when you were growing up?
The porch was interesting to me because that was the reason that I wrote my play Porches, is because that was what we used to do, is gather on our porches, and every scene in my play takes place on a porch. And this lady reminds me a little bit of my grandmother, and we used to sit on her front porch. She lived on Lansing too, but further down. And she was at 2414 North Lansing. And I remember the times that we had on that porch and in the yard. And the yard was swept clean so that the dirt was hard packed. And right in front of the porch, she would sweep that dirt so that we could all gather. If we couldn't fit on the porch, we could fit down in front of the porch on summer evenings, and the neighbors. And those were times that I still remember. Those were good times. And this year, 1969, I had just left Tulsa in 1969 and didn't return to live until 84. But when I came back in 84, and everything was swept away due to urban renewal, I couldn't remember where anything had been that was between Archer and Pine.
One of the interesting things too about those days also was people would leave their doors open, screen doors open. People would walk by and have no problems. I'm sure that was the case in a lot of neighborhoods, white or black. But the people trusted one another. But now you can't leave your doors open. You have to lock them. All this security that's going on. It's unfortunate, but those were happy days, I can imagine.
Yeah.
Deborah, when you were growing up, which street did you grow up on in Greenwood?
Well, I grew up across the street from my grandmother at 2413 North Lansing. And then when I was about 9 or 10, about 8 years old, we moved to Zion Place, which was like 4 blocks from 2414 North Lansing. So I grew up actually near what is now Lacey Park, which before that was Lincoln Park, and before that was Berry Park. So that was the area that I grew up in. But on Lansing, where my aunt lived, at the 1300 block, I spent a lot of time there as well because she had a beauty shop there. Yeah. And so, and when my mother was working, the cousins, we'd hang out at Aunt Vera's house. And it was Man Brothers Groceries, Gibbs Market, and then my aunt's house and beauty shop.
Wow. Deborah, you mentioned Berry Park, the little historical point that Simon Berry was an entrepreneur, a black entrepreneur here in Tulsa, that owned an airplane back in the 1900s.
Wow.
He was the first and only black pilot in this city. He owned also a jitney service that ran through up and down Greenwood. The city of Tulsa bought his jitney service, which turned out to be the bus service that we have today. He actually started the first bus service.
Don, can you explain what a jitney is for people who may not know what the jitney is?
Well, a jitney is a little vehicle that Mr. Barber put people in, and various type of automobiles and
like
so forth.
Uber.
They carry them back and forth from everywhere.
Like Uber?
Yeah.
I'm sorry?
Like Uber?
Like Uber, right. He was the first Uber.
First Uber.
But he had that jitney service back in I believe back in actually before the 21 massacre. He had one of those biplanes. In fact, Mr. Berry would take oil field workers, oil executives around to their leases in his airplane. So imagine that. He was the first to do that. Fantastic story.
Deborah, may I ask a question? This reminded the comments about the neighborhood and the jitney service and the men's groceries and the beauty shop. That reminds me of how walkable how walkable Greenwood was. And I think it's so ironic that we have built a community that is only car-centered. And what we're trying to get back to now are walkable neighborhoods. And if only we looked at Greenwood and Kendall Whittier and other neighborhoods that were these walkable neighborhoods.
Yes, that's absolutely true.
Because even where we lived on Lansing by Berry Park, we had a neighborhood grocery store. And so Greenwood was our downtown. So if we wanted to really, really do things, we would go to Greenwood. And so we had, the Rex Theater was down there when I was growing up, and and I went to Paradise Baptist Church, which was right off of Greenwood, and then when we were sneaking out after Sunday school before church started, there was a candy store on Greenwood where we would use our little change that we were supposed to put in the offering. So everything was like right there. I remember Easter Parade on Greenwood, and then later, before urban renewal, on Lansing, my uncles had a pool hall near a barber shop down on Lansing, and so there was just everything was there. And then where I lived over by Berry Park, like I said, we had a little grocery store on Peoria called Scoggins grocery store, and that's where we used to walk and buy the big giant pickles, the jar that sat on the counter. And I was within walking distance of school. I went to Booker T and walked to school every day.
Well, a lot of people don't, actually a lot of people forget that Lansing Avenue, right east of Greenwood, was very, very vibrant. It had, several businesses on that street. In fact, one of my dad's cousins, first cousin, had a barber shop, pool hall, beauty shop on Lansing Avenue. There were churches, there were barber shops, Rex Theater was located on Lansing Avenue. Everything that anyone would want was right there on Lansing and also in Greenwood. In fact, on Greenwood, the dollar turned over at least 6, 7, or 8 times before it left the community. That is one of the reasons why Greenwood was so prosperous, because people bought from each other. They bought from businesses around in the general area. And like I said, the dollar turned around. It hardly ever left the Greenwood area, unless it was something, that they needed on the side of it. Greenwood, from Archer to Pine, you had 2 miles of vibrant, successful men and women who had businesses on that street. Very proud men and women who wanted to be prosperous, who wanted to leave what they left from the South, like Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and all those other areas, was to have a life for themselves. They were seeking a life other than what they knew, and that was discrimination, racism, bigotry, and all these other things, lynchings. They wanted to get away from those areas in the South, and they came to Oklahoma, they came to Tulsa because they felt this to be a safe haven. And Oklahoma at that time was a safe haven for most of them. Until 1907, when the state of Oklahoma became a state, and then the Oklahoma legislators, for the first time, what they did, they instituted Jim Crow laws.
It was the very first law.
And disenfranchised everybody.
Yeah, it was the Jim Crow law, their first law.
This photograph is Shine Parlor, 1970. God, it's been so long ago. You can see this man, he's gesturing with his hand. At the top of this mural, at the top, you see his, this is John F. Kennedy, the president. It had been 7 years, I believe, since he was assassinated in Dallas. And what he's doing, he's looking at an unseen individual. And what I wanted to do was to try to show him with this gesture, because at that time, we had a dream. Most Black Americans, African American men and women had a dream that John F. Kennedy had popularized. He said, well, this is a new thing that we're going to try to make America more available to everyone. We're going to try to reduce and try to rid this country of all of its evils and things. And this is what African American men believed in. But when he was assassinated, that dream died with him. And it's sort of like, when I took this photograph, I was thinking of that same thing. Then the fact is that the president, John F. Kennedy, on the wall was there, made that all come to fruition.
That was one of the things that in black households, and, you had a picture of Jesus, Abraham Lincoln, and John F. Kennedy.
Deborah, growing up in a predominantly black community, was it when you went to Booker T that you had more contact with whites?
No, we were still segregated when I went to Booker T.
Really? When would that be?
Yeah, that it wasn't integrated until 71, 72. I graduated in 68.
Yeah.
So Tulsa was still segregated all that time. So I didn't have any exposure to white people other than the people that my parents worked for until I left in 69 and my husband was in the Air Force.
I think Booker T. Washington was integrated in 73.
72, yeah.
Yeah, I think it was integrated in 73. I was fortunate to be a graduate of Booker T. Washington High School and one of the best high schools in the nation. When I was there, and whenever you could go to Booker T, actually, yeah. The teachers were fantastic. They did not let you leave that room or leave that class unless you knew the subject matter. And they were very diligent about their teaching. They were absolutely wonderful teachers. They loved their students. And they made them feel that they can actually achieve anything that they set their heart and minds to. I was very fortunate to be a graduate of Booker T. And very fortunate to go back to Booker T to be a teacher. Taught photography there for over 10 years.
One of the common fallacies is that Booker T became
Magnet.
the fallacy is that it became well known because it was a magnet school. But it was a top class school before then.
Absolutely.
A lot of our teachers taught at Booker T because they were not allowed to teach in colleges. So they had their master's degrees. Remember Medeiros?
Yeah.
He had his PhD. And so, we had top class teachers. And we didn't have the best equipment. We had used books that came from South Tulsa School that had pages missing and writing and scribbles all in them, and the bindings were broken. But we had teachers who cared about us. Our teachers lived in our neighborhoods. They went to school with our parents or taught our parents.
Absolutely.
And so it was, Booker T was a community.
That's right. I have a former teacher right here.
That's right.
Yeah. She's a former teacher.
Mary Bethany.
And
And I'm one of her students. So there are several either PTA, Booker T alumni, or teachers in the audience. If you're at Booker T, if you have an association with Booker T, will you raise your hand? Yes. There is an amazing legacy with Booker T from the students when it was founded and Principal Woods all the way to today.
That's right. One of the things also about Booker T was a school that was falling apart when I was there. It was falling apart when you were there. Holes in the walls, water stains everywhere. The city of Tulsa apologized to the citizens of North Tulsa a few years ago because Booker T. Washington was built with inferior material. They put their contracts out and they chose the least, the less person or the less contractor to do the work. When Dr. Don Thompson came to Tulsa a few years ago, several years ago, he toured Booker T. Washington. He could not believe what he was seeing. It was a mess. He said he's been to a lot of schools all over the nation. He's never seen any school that was in such worse condition as that school was. Finally, he was able to get a $94 million bond issue passed to rebuild and redo Booker T. Washington. What you have today, I believe, is a very beautiful, modern type structure. But I was amazed at that when the city of Tulsa apologized to the citizens of North Tulsa for building the construction that went into that school.
And we had there were classes that were not even offered at Booker T when I was there. And so we had, but the year that I graduated, class of 68, 3 of my classmates were National Merit Scholar winners because Mr. Jackson and Mr. Medeiros, Mr. Archer, they created the classes that were needed for these students to be able to take that National Merit exam.
Yes, the students at Booker T. Washington went on to some fantastic careers. I have a young man by the name of Paul Taggart. Paul Taggart was in my class. You remember him. Paul Taggart was a fantastic student. He was a photographer. In fact, Paul Taggart taught me a lot of things about photography, and that's what I was appreciated about. A lot of students actually taught me about a lot of things about photography that I didn't know. Paul Taggart went on to become a freelance photographer. He was captured in Iraq when the Iraqi war was going on. During that time, the Iraqis were beheading anyone who was captured, American soldiers, whoever it was, journalists and so forth. And I remember that one of the Tulsa World reporters came by to my house and asked me what I thought about what was going on with Paul Taggart. I had no idea what she was talking about. What are you talking about? He said, "Don't you know that Paul Taggart has been captured by the Iraqis and that he's going to be beheaded?" In fact, and I did not know that. And but anyway, make a long story short, he was released finally after being in prison for a year or so. He was finally released. And Paul Taggart now is working in New York, and he's a freelance photographer for the New York Times and several other newspapers. But I'm so happy to see some of my students go on to fantastic careers in photography and photojournalism and other areas. Because of the fact is that they had such a wealth, got such good training from the teachers there, and they just gravitated to that excellence. So I was very happy to see that.
Don, did you want to talk about this work? Speaking of children, student age.
You know, it's ironic. This is a young man that he was 22 years old when I photographed him. And in fact, I photographed him, if you could go back to that.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah.
I forget to push that other button.
And he consented for me to photograph. He was in an alleyway, and I got the proper type of lighting. And the photograph is in the exhibit upstairs. Like I said, he was 22 years old when I took this photograph. And it's ironic that he reminds me of Trayvon Martin, who was killed in 2012 in Florida. And we sort of go back to what's going on today with George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Terrence Crutcher, who was killed here by the police here in Tulsa. So I'm a little bit, well, I don't know how I can explain that. When I look at this photograph, I think of Trayvon. I think of also others that have been, violently killed by the police. And well, it's an ironic story that's happening, and it continues to happen today. And we hope that one day this will not continue, the killing of unarmed black men, women, even some children. But we hope that will cease to be. Deborah, you got any comment?
Yeah, I have a grandson who, he's an adult now, but when he was a teenager, he worked at one of the Brahms stores. And sometimes he worked till close. And I told him multiple times, do not walk home. If you are working, if you're closing, call me. And of course, being a teenage boy, he was like, yeah, right, Mama, I'm fine, I can take care of myself.
We have a question here, Mark.
Yes. First of all, thank you so much for the gift that you both are and what you bring to the world through Tulsa. We are so grateful for you. Thank you. Deborah and Don, I've had the pleasure of sitting at y'all's feet, learning all about life. I'd love you to talk a bit about the relationship that your art has to activism. Don, you've often said that your camera is your weapon of choice in the revolution for justice. So could you guys talk a little bit about the relationship between art and activism?
Well, let me just say thank you for that question. This is Marlon Hall. Marlon is from Houston, Texas.
Yes, sir, H-Town.
Well, thank you for the question. I'm very passionate in what I do with my photography. I use my photography or my camera as Marlon had said, as a weapon against injustice, a weapon against oppression, a weapon against inequalities in this city and around the world. And what I hope my photography will do, what my images will try to change the perception of what some people may think of men and women of color. Some of us think of men and women of color as being inhuman, as not looking, of course, the same way they look, and I'm talking about white folks. But the fact is that we all are human beings. We're all part of the human race. And I think there's a lot of less of empathy going on, where people are not really understanding and attempt to understand people of color. And I think we need to get to that point where we understand and try to attempt to understand what's going on. And this is what I try to do with my photography. I try to change perceptions. I try to make you emotionally involved in the image that I'm showing to you. To look at this image, to look at this young man and say, okay, he has a hood on, so what? He's not a criminal. He's a human being. He's a man, he's a boy. He has a life, he has a mother, he has a father. You know, like we all do.
And my weapon of choice is my words. My poetry, most of my poetry has to do with social justice issues. And the way I describe myself in one of my poems, it's called My Poems Are Too Loud. And I describe myself in that poem as I am TNT in a petite package with a short fuse. And so I use my poetry to tell stories. I often will either create characters and speak in the voice of the characters that I've created, or I will tell the stories of incidents that have happened. But almost all of my poetry has to do with social justice issues. And people say, don't you write nice poems? And I'm like, this is not necessarily a nice world. And so that's, I use my voice as my weapon.
Just tell you a little story about myself. When I came to Oklahoma, came to Tulsa when I was a teenager. My dad and mother brought me here from California. Once I got here to Oklahoma, got here to Tulsa, I didn't want to stay. I wanted to go back. My dad was very wise, and what he did, he took my two brothers and I downtown. I was about 13 or 14 years old. He dropped us off downtown on Main Street. And he says, boys, go on and walk around, and I'll give you a couple of dollars, and if you want to go into some of the stores, go ahead and purchase what you think, what you want. And so we did. We went into Crest Department Store. It was on Main Street at the time. You remember that?
I remember Crest, yeah. One of the few stores we could go in.
That's true.
Yeah.
We walked in there, and we were walking around, and all of a sudden I started to feel someone watching me. And I looked around, and seemed like people were watching me and also following me. And I got out of the store, I asked my brother, have you felt people looking at you or watching you? I felt the same way. In fact, I know that there were some people watching us and also following us. So we got to the corner where Dad dropped us off. He got into the car, and he took us back to the house, and he asked us what we felt. What did we think? And we told him. And he told us, I'll never forget. He said, I did this for a purpose, so that you will know what you're going to be faced with here in Tulsa. You're going to have to live with this. But I wanted you to find out exactly what racism is all about. Because you're going to have to be faced with it. My dad had only an 8th grade education, but he was far, far wise beyond his years. He wanted to show us, to teach us in some way, an example, an experience of racism that we were going to be faced with in this city. I have been faced with a lot of racism. I have been faced with a lot of discrimination and oppression in this city. All these, and I'm not going to say you probably know how old I am, but I'm pretty old. It's been a long journey that I've been here in Tulsa. And I faced a lot of things. But let me just say this before Deborah takes over. I am very optimistic at this juncture in my life. When I see young men, boys and girls, young men and so forth, of all colors, marching here in Tulsa, when they had this disturbance that was going on, Black Lives Matter, I see an optimistic outcome. These young boys and girls will not take no for an answer. They're going to fight against this oppression. They're going to fight against injustice. They're going to fight against all of this racism that is going on in this world. This is a worldwide movement. I'm very optimistic about what's going on in this world today with these young men. Back in my day, back in the 60s, when I was actively involved in the civil rights movement in Tulsa, I didn't see that too much. But what I see today of these young men, they are absolutely will not take no for an answer. They will be marching, and they will continue to march until oppression, inequalities, and injustice is defeated. Thank you,
Mr. Thompson, actually it's not a question so much as it is a comment. All of the photographs that I've seen upstairs and here, it's a huge amount of dignity. It's just that just shines through it, and the stuff that you're talking about, Deborah, too, and I've known your writing for years. It expresses indignity with such eloquence that it is itself dignified. And I'm just in awe of both of your work. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Well, this man right here his name is Fiery. Well, they called his name, he gave me his name as Fiery. And this was during the 2020 Juneteenth celebration. We have a wall on Greenwood that a lady has dedicated her wall to people to come by and just make notes on it. His words is love. And that's what we need. Love. Love will change the world. And Mr. Fiery here, he's chalking all over, and people were just going all over and putting their little notes on it. He had a message. He said, all we are going to contend with this is to love one another.
I think that when I think of Greenwood, it's not just, I think of it as it's continuing, not just before the massacre, during the massacre, after the massacre. It's all together. And when I think of urban renewal, it was Highway I-244 was created. Urban renewal was created to reinstitute segregation. I mean, across the country. I mean, that was the purpose of urban renewal. So these highways came through major cities, through Tulsa, St. Louis, through Kansas City, through cities all across the country, specifically to reinstitute segregation. And so, and we saw that happening here, and I didn't realize until later years when I started doing my own research that it was not just happening here. It made me furious, and I'm still angry. And the things that happen as a result of racism are things that I will never stop being angry about. And I'm justifiably angry. So this is something that people don't always understand, is that our anger is fresh. It is never going away until racism goes away. And it is not our job to end racism because we aren't the ones who create it.
That's true.
I'm from Dallas, and I'll be bringing a group here for the celebration or the not celebration, commemoration. And one of the things that, I mean, my group, we love history, but is never to forget the injustices that blacks have faced and they still face, especially with all the voting laws that are now putting us back in the Jim Crow era. How can we as a society, when half of people agree that that's okay for it still to happen? And I'm with you, I'm angry. My husband has said to me one time, "You're an angry black woman." And I am, because one of the things that I wish in my life, I get at the subject that every white person could be black for just a day. It would be a life-changing experience. But what I face now, I don't see, I'm not as optimistic as you are, Don, because I see it getting worse. I see people having to stand in line to vote. The vote is the voice. And still it's okay with over half of the people in the United States, or the United Shades of America, which is a better way to put it. And this is all we have. I mean, we love this country. We have endured more than any ethnic group of people built the country for free. And then we have people who disrespect or don't care only because you were born, not because of your choice, but you were born black. Born black shouldn't be a curse. I have as much respect for white people as I do for black people. But I don't have respect for the people that still allow the laws to be passed and continued that are unjust for our race. Thank you for what you're doing, Don. Keep your camera going. And thank you, Deborah, for what you're doing. Keep that voice going, because I don't see it ending for us. We have a battle on our hands.
Well, absolutely. I believe that's absolutely true. But you know, one of the things I was trying to point out in that little physically that I was talking about was that children, young men and boys, will be changing this world. It's time that the old folks let young folks move and let them do what they need to do in order to change this world. And I believe they will. I'm optimistic because I've seen them doing the work that needs to be done to fight injustice, to see that this world changes and this America lives up to its
True meaning.
lives up to its ideals that all men are created equal. This is what I'm talking about. I mean, but I think that the change will come about, and it will come about because of young men and young women's efforts involved.
Just to add in those women, and don't forget the women in here too.
Young men and women.
Yeah.
I always, I'm awful with names. The woman who teaches about racism, she's a white woman. And I've seen videos of her, and I can't think of her name now. But one of the questions she asked of a white audience once was if they believed that black people were experiencing racism, and a lot of them were like, no. And then she said, how many of you would want to be black? And none of them, of course, want to be black. So that was the answer to the question right then. If you don't want to be black, then you know what we're going through. You know what we're going through because you don't want to be us.
One of the important messages that Deborah was saying is that we didn't create racism. We didn't create discrimination. We didn't create bigotry, but it's up to you to make those changes. It's up to you to make those changes, but we didn't do any of that. And I appreciate you saying that, Deborah.
You have another question?
Yes, I have a question. My name is John Sanders. And, I wanted to thank Deborah for doing this, first of all. I wanted to say something because I got really excited hearing you talk about Bertie and some of the things you photographed on Greenwood. I'm a graduate of Bertie, and I think it became a magnet school in 74. I was a sophomore in 73, which tells my age, but that's okay.
I've already told mine, so that's all I have.
So, and I wanted to corroborate what you said about the teachers were excellent. I had Mr. Jackson as a teacher. He was fantastic. And I wanted to ask you about something. I had an uncle, actually it's my father's uncle, who had a restaurant on Greenwood. It was Bell's Barbecue. Does that sound familiar at all to you? And I wonder if you had any pictures, maybe if you thought you may have of that.
Bell's Barbecue?
Yeah, his name was George Bell. And
I remember Bell's Barbecue. I remember that. I remember that barbecue.
And my dad used to take me there in the evenings before he closed, and I'd watch him clean up and do the things that he did at the end of the day at the restaurant. But I never knew what happened to it. And I just wondered if maybe that's my
I remember Bell's Barbecue on Greenwood.
Okay.
In fact, the matter, Bell's Barbecue had the best barbecue on Greenwood. And I appreciate that too, because I remember specifically that we would pass all the other barbecues. There were a lot of barbecue restaurants on Greenwood. They all competed against one another. I mean, they were out there competing against one another because they wanted to find out who was the best barbecue. And Bell's, to me, I don't know, Deborah, whether you heard any interest in that or not.
Bell's?
Well, Bell's Barbecue was on Greenwood.
Yes.
And I remember that really well because we used to go there all the time to get our barbecue.
One last thing, I just wanted to also thank you and remind you that you've actually been in my house, which I'm privileged to say. You took a picture of my father-in-law, Dr. Charles Lewis, if you remember. Charles Lewis, yeah.
Dr. Charles Drew was your father?
No, Lewis.
He was
a dentist.
Oh, Dr. Charles Lewis.
Yes.
Dr. Charles Lewis and I go back a long way.
Yes.
Dr. Charles Lewis is one of the best dentists that we have in North Tulsa. In fact, Dr. Charles Lewis started a golf club called the Capitol Golf Club.
Well, this is his car.
Oh yeah, Dr. Charles Lewis. This is his daughter right here.
Right.
Dr. Charles Lewis was a very, very astute and very great man. I miss him really because we played golf a lot back in the day. And
It was before Tiger Woods. They thought that black people didn't play golf.
all Capitol Golf
Or
was
tennis. My father tried to teach me tennis. I tried to play tennis, so yeah.
Dr. Lewis started All Capital Golf back years ago. One of his, I remember he invited Joe Lewis to come to Tulsa, and Joe Lewis played golf in his tournament at Mohawk Golf Course. That was some years ago. And, yeah, it's good to see you. Good to see you here.
Thank you very much.
I just wanted to say that I know my father would be so proud. I mean, it means the world to me because I'm on the staff here at Philbrook, and it means the world to me to see you home, you and your wife.
Thank you. And great man, very much.
Do we have one last question? We're just about at time. Do we have one last question? Dr. Galusha, do you have a question?
I'm very impressed by everybody here sharing what they really believe. And I was very impressed by what you pointed out, that somebody said you would really be very different if you could be black for just 4 or 5 days. It all reminds me of one of the most famous philosophers, Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant says, remember, you see things not as they are, but as you are.
Yeah. Yeah. Very, very, very profound. Very profound. Susan, do we have any other photographs to show, or is that the
Well,
last one?
are there any that you would like to, specifically like to look at? I know you wanted to look at Bethlehem Steel.
Oh, yeah, well, that's a good story. Buffalo,
yeah.
yeah, this Bethlehem, do you remember that?
Yeah, one of my uncles used to work at Bethlehem Steel.
Bethlehem Steel was probably one of the few industries on Greenwood, in the Greenwood area. It's still in that Greenwood area. They call it the Pin Tube building. It's one located on Archer. And from what I understand, the city of Tulsa is trying to repurpose the building and trying to put in some type of other installations. They want to save the building, because this building goes back. In fact, the Pin Tube building, if you look at some of the old photographs of the 1921 massacre, you could see in the east side the buildings that was there back in that day. It's still existing. Bethlehem Steel provided employment to a lot of black men back in the day.
Yeah, it was one of the places that, when you knew that someone that worked at Bethlehem Steel, you knew that they had a steady job.
Yeah.
And it was one of the few places that employed a lot of white men.
Absolutely. Provided a lot of economic substance for families, men and women, men that worked there. It's a hard job, very hard labor, but it offered employment. It offered a way for men to support their families and to try to provide a way for them. And it was very, I had no idea when it shut down, but it was during the time that Greenwood was going through its phases. Another thing I'd like to explain to you about Greenwood and what happened. In a sense, back in the 60s and 70s, I believe there were 3 things that happened to Greenwood that caused its demise. And one of those things was I-244, the highway that came straight through the heart of Greenwood. It was actually moved into that area. Like Deborah was saying, that happened not only in Tulsa, but it happened in Detroit, happened in Chicago, it happened all over in the East Coast area. It went through the black communities purposely, destroyed a lot of communities, a lot of black folks, and it destroyed the whole thing. Now what happened to that was, the result of that, generational wealth was destroyed in those areas. The businesses that were there did not pass on to their children, so they can keep that going. Those businesses and men and were displaced. That's what happened to Greenwood. Another thing that really happened also, in 1960, the city of Tulsa passed an accommodation bill. Excuse me. Passed an accommodation bill that was actually used, in a sense, to desegregate some businesses and also housing. So what happened is, black men and women, they bypassed some of the businesses on Greenwood and Lansing and went to the south side and started catering to the south side area, which caused a depression economically to a lot of businesses, so they started closing. I have a photograph that I took in 1978, and we don't have it here, that shows Greenwood boarded up, all boarded up. It looked like a ghost town. When I was walking through there trying to document what I was seeing, you saw a ghost town, completely and totally empty of all, men and women. The streets were empty. I was walking up and down the street by myself, taking photographs. But, like I said, there are three things that happened. I-244 cut through the heart of Greenwood. It took out hotels. It took out businesses, pool halls, sundry shops. It took out barber shops. It took out drugstores. It took out a lot of businesses. That was one thing. Of course, another thing was the Garnett, sanctioned by the city of Tulsa, that came through the area, systematically destroying everything in sight. I watched those bulldozers taking out businesses, taking out men's lives, houses, and all that. I couldn't stop them. The only thing I can do was take my camera and try to document what I could. Because they were doing what they could. It seemed like they didn't have any direction. They were just tearing down everything, tearing down. That wasn't for Mr. Ed Goodwin, who was the publisher of the Oklahoma Eagle. He came along and approached the city of Tulsa. He said, I'd like to buy these buildings. What you see now on Greenwood, at the corner of Archer and Greenwood, is what was left. Now, mind you, there was 2 miles from Archer to Greenwood, solidly built of businesses, men and women walking up and down the street. You have all types of businesses on that street. The only thing that's left on Greenwood now is what you see there. It was systematically destroyed by urban renewal and also of the highway that went through there. Deborah, you have anything to add?
No, that's it. I think we also had, because so much was destroyed and people it was necessary for them, we had to disperse, So we had to move out of the area because people wanted to be closer to schools and closer to businesses, closer to their jobs. And gradually, they started closing all the black schools and busing kids to white schools. So that was another thing that happened. So families moved out because their kids were being bused to other schools, so they moved further out to be closer to the schools that their kids were being bused to. And so that further brought the population down in North Tulsa, brought the population down in the schools, and then they justified closing the schools because there was nobody attending. So everything turned out to be, it's like a vicious cycle that is created specifically to keep the black population at a certain level. You cannot live here because of redlining. You can't get a loan. You can't get a mortgage. If you build your house in this particular area, you can only have this amount of land. You can't have 2 lots. You can only have 1 lot. And so it's all systematic. And when we talk about racism, it is an ism. It is a system. That is created specifically for the benefit of people who are white, particularly white males. But the systems are created to work against us.
The whole area of Greenwood was redlined, so therefore men and women could not get, loans to rebuild, to reestablish their businesses. So they were locked out, systematically locked out of the loan programs and the banks and so forth in the area. So they couldn't reestablish themselves. So they had no alternative but to leave, which caused the situation that we had. So it was a systematic, I believe, means of getting Greenwood destroyed in a sense, what the 1921 massacre could not destroy. The urban renewal highway to that accomplished that.
And the highway was finished just about in 1971, which is the 50th anniversary. So seeing that, again, systematic. And maybe a last comment before the end of the, do we have another question? Maybe one last question. We're over time, but this is such an amazing and important conversation. It's hard to cut it off, but I want to make sure we get all our questions in.
Again, thank you guys. This has been so amazing. Such a history lesson. I didn't grow up in Tulsa. I'm from down the turnpike, Oklahoma City, but I did see a picture that was flipped through of Mother Grace Tucker. Can you talk about what she meant to Tulsa? It looked like a pretty young picture of her. I'm not sure, but can you talk a little bit about what she meant to Tulsa?
Oh, this is Mother Tucker.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah, there she is.
I took this photograph, I think it was 1972, yes. Mother Tucker had 16 children.
Oh, wow.
And she was a dynamic lady who went into preaching. She was a preacher. And this is a photograph that was taken at her church, which was located on Martin Luther King Boulevard, right off Martin Luther King Boulevard. Not only was she dynamic, she had also a home for the homeless. She fed, clothed, and housed men and women in the area who came to her homeless shelter. She was very influential. She was an activist. She felt her call was to help the poor, the needy.
She was outspoken.
And the
She was very
Absolutely.
outspoken and driven.
Yes, she was driven, and she's passed on now. The area where she had her shelter home has been demolished. It was in the Brady area, and that's where she had her homeless shelter. But she was a very dynamic lady. She was very outspoken, and she helped a lot of men and women to overcome addiction, poverty, and other things that were involved in their lives. She was very dynamic in that area.
One thing I understand about Mother Tucker was that she met you where you were. Whatever you needed, she gave you. A home, food, clothing, and she met you wherever you were emotionally and physically also. There was no sobriety requirement to be served by her, which I think we can learn a lot from today. And I can attest that her influence continues today, even though she has passed on. I was lucky enough to give a tour a couple of weeks ago, and one of the young men in the tour stopped and really looked at the photograph, and he didn't walk away. And I went up and I talked to him, and he said, "That's Mother Tucker." And I said, "Yes." He said, "I was there. She helped me."
Whoa.
So just in that one sentence, she helped me. You knew that there was a whole lifetime of stories in that. And so I can't tell you how lucky we are to have these photographs at Philbrook, to be able to see these stories and to see these connections. And I do hope you go up and see the exhibition and really look at the photographs. And if you have any responses that you would like to add to the photographs, if anything strikes you, we would like to add your responses to the wall.